Hi everybody, thanks for joining me today. It's great to be part of this event. My name is Lena Kraus. I'm a former council member and the former chair of the European Democratic Education Community, and I'm speaking to you today from Edinburgh, Scotland. To get us started, I would like to invite you to close your eyes and think of a moment where you were very proud. So it's good to think of a really big moment where something really important happened that you were proud of, but it's also really important to look at the smaller everyday moments. And once you've found something, you could think of why you were proud in that particular moment, what exactly it was that made you proud. All right, thank you. So the reason I wanted to start with this is that that's pretty much the question I used to do some research into democratic education environments, and that's what I'm going to talk about today. So for now, I'm going to give you a quick overview over my presentation. I've been told that some of you might not be familiar with democratic education, and so I will give you a quick refresher on that. Then I'll go into my research method, how it worked, what exactly it was I did, and what we can, draw from it. And after that, we're going to look into some of the findings a little bit more specifically. And these findings are mainly about inclusivity in democratic education spaces, concepts of achievement and belonging, and also structures of validation. And then we're going to summarize the whole thing and just look at what that means going forward. Okay, so this is the recap on democratic education. The two main principles of democratic education are self-directed learning and shared decision-making. Now, self-directed learning is exactly what it sounds like. It means that at democratic schools, the child is in charge of their own learning. So they can decide what they want to learn, how they want to learn it, with whom they want to learn it, and when they want to learn it. So they're completely in charge of their own time, as long as they stay within the rules of the community. And that brings us to the second aspect of democratic education, shared decision-making. Now, at democratic schools, every week there's a school meeting where everything, all the decisions that affect the whole school community are made democratically. So that's also where democratic education gets its name from. And in those meetings, everybody who's a part of the school community, children and adults alike, get an equal vote on all of the decisions. And everybody can make proposals, everybody can suggest things, and everybody has a voice for discussing these things. There's a great video if you want to find out more about democratic education itself. On the SLDEC website, you can find a lot of useful resources and also a video explaining this in a bit more detail. In this next part, I'm going to talk about the research I did and the method I used. My looking into concepts of achievement started with a bit of a contradiction. Diversity and equality are central values in democratic education contexts. Yet the democratic education spaces that I was looking at in Europe were usually very white and very middle class. So as you can see on this slide, the central values in democratic education didn't match the actual demographic at democratic schools. Now, people have been remarking on this, and there is a very easy explanation, which is that in European countries, democratic schools can usually not be public schools, so they rely on the parents of the students to pay fees to send their children there. However, I think we need to look a little further than that, because even though most democratic schools are private fee-paying schools, most of them have solidarity structures in place or bursaries, and they actively encourage people to apply if they're convinced by the concept, even if they cannot necessarily afford the standard fee. So I thought that people's concepts of achievement could be very helpful for understanding this discrepancy. Concepts of achievement are different for everybody. Like, you all have your very own concept of what constitutes an achievement, and you were getting some insights into your own concept of achievement when you thought about the proud moment at the beginning of this presentation. These concepts of achievement that are put forward collectively by democratic education contexts might be helpful in understanding the difference between the values and the actual demographic at democratic schools. What I did was, at a SLDEC conference in Greece, this is the annual conference that the European Democratic Education Community holds, I conducted 20 very open interviews. And basically, I just asked people a very similar question to what I asked you at the beginning of this presentation. I asked them, would you please tell me about a situation where you were very proud and explain why? And then I recorded their answers. To analyze the answers, I used a method called qualitative data analysis, QDA, and it's a software-based data analysis system. Basically, it's very useful for finding shared factors in people's answers. So while concepts of achievement are highly individual, depending on your context, you will also always have like shared features. And qualitative data analysis works in like analyzing the answers. So you can see on this slide, you have an answer, and then you look into what this thing that the person said actually means, and you assign it a certain code. For example, if people said, oh, I'm proud that I did this because it was completely new to me, another person might say, I'm proud I did this because it was the first time I tried something like that. Then that basically means the same or a very similar thing, that somebody is proud because they did something that forced them to step outside of their comfort zone. So I assign a code, stepping out of comfort zone, and then I collect all the answers that fit within that category. So that allowed me to establish main categories and subcategories in all the answers that I collected, and thus research these people's concepts of achievement. The study I did is purely explorative, so it doesn't actually prove anything. It's not aiming to provide any conclusive findings, but what it does is it points us towards which aspects of this might be really interesting to look at a bit further. Something that's important to acknowledge is that, of course, I conducted this study in a European democratic education context, so some of the observations might not play a role for the context that you're in. However, the underlying principle of what you need to look at if you want to make meaningful change remain the same. I'm gonna give you an overview over some of the categories that people mentioned in the interview. Examples, as you can see on the slide, were like a main category of personal growth. So this was like proving oneself, feeling competent, stepping out of one's comfort zone, learning something new, things like that. But also something I found interesting, just like the act of making a decision was something that people were proud of. So just the skill of decision making. This is not taking into account the outcome of that decision. feeling in the right place, self-expression, for example, by creating art, creating something new, building something, self-directed action, so just the fact that this person that I interviewed did something and made all the decisions themselves, fostering community, feeling useful and helping others, and also just having a positive outlook was regarded as an achievement. So this is where we get to the findings of my study. Particularly interesting with regard to inclusivity is that in all the interviews I conducted, there was no mention of traditional markers of achievement. For example, monetary rewards like a pay rise, trophies, medals, rewards, awards, or grades. And that is where part of the solution, or part of the explanation to the difference between the values and the actual demographic at democratic schools comes in. If the concept of achievement that is put forward by democratic schools, so this is not at the school themselves, but when people talk about democratic education, if that concept of achievement does not match with the concepts of achievement of part of the desired target group, part of the people that democratic schools would want to attract to their schools, then that creates a barrier. Because, of course, concepts of achievement are very, very important in making educational choices for yourself and also for your children, because you want to be somewhere, learn somewhere, send your child somewhere where you believe that they will be able to achieve. So what constitutes an achievement in your mind majorly influences what you choose in terms of education. There are certain traditional markers of achievement, like the grades, having good grades, having a good degree, earning a lot of money, or just earning enough money to get to live from in the first place, that certain people can afford to ignore and certain people cannot afford to ignore. This comes down to Bourdieu's definitions of capital. You can have economic capital if you have enough money that you don't have to worry about whether yourself or your children earn enough money to live on or earn enough money to afford a certain standard of living. Then you can afford to kind of neglect the outcome of their schooling in terms of grades. Like, if they don't get a job, you have enough money in the bank to buy them food anyway. There's also social capital. So this is basically, it means connections. If your family is connected well enough, then you might believe that it's not that important how well your child does at school, because even if they do badly, you have the necessary connections that might help them get a job. Again, this is where traditional markers of achievement can be ignored because you have enough capital, in this case social capital, to be able to ignore them. And then another really interesting one is cultural capital. So to this, I actually looked into this quite in depth. There's another study by Deppe who looked into class and educational choices, especially grades in Germany. There is a certain threshold of cultural capital above which the fact that learning takes place at school is taken for granted. They don't need proof that their child is learning. And this proof, for example, are grades, getting good grades. So the study by Deppe actually found that upper middle class families tend to place less importance on the grades that their children get, because they can take it for granted that the child learns something at school. Whereas working class and lower middle class people were more concerned with what grades their children got at school, because to them that is the main proof that the child is learning something. Now, This whole thing is not about changing anything in the educational practice at democratic schools. It's just saying maybe it's worth looking into how we talk about it, how we present it. Because it's not like all these traditional markers of achievement don't exist for people at democratic schools. People who've been to democratic schools go on to get very good grades, they find jobs that they enjoy where they earn enough money to make a living. You know, they continue to be very successful people, even by traditional standards, traditional concepts of achievement. It's just that this is not put forward usually in how we talk about democratic education. And if it was, if we created a more holistic representation of concepts of achievement at democratic schools, then maybe that would make our education spaces a whole lot more inclusive. So something very important to consider in terms of all this. I've now talked a lot about inclusivity in terms of social class and in terms of the different forms of capital. However, this is also a race issue. People of color in Europe, I looked at data from the UK in order to do the research on this, are more likely to belong to the social groups that are excluded by these narratives of achievement, so excluded from democratic education spaces. And then that creates a whole other problem, which is a problem of representation. If there are no teachers of color, there are no other students of color in democratic education spaces, then again, parents of color are less likely to consider this educational context for their child. And this is something that we need to look at. We can't ignore the facts, like the good intentions. They're nice to have, but they're not enough. We need to consider the facts. And this is where, like, even though this research pertains to a very specific problem in the European context, this principle applies to all contexts. Like, if you want to achieve something for your school and it's not happening, you need to really look into the mechanisms of why it might not be happening. So what I can't stress enough with regard to this is that democratic education spaces themselves are very, very well equipped to cater for the values that they stand for. So in the democratic education spaces themselves, there is every prerequisite for being truly inclusive, for having a truly diverse student population. This is illustrated in the findings of my study as well, through the fact that in a lot of interviews, the interviewee mentioned both individuality as well as community. And it's key here that these were mentioned by the same person. So not just that they were mentioned by people within the study, but that there were various interviews where the same person mentioned both of those. And this is a strong indicator of democratic education spaces creating an atmosphere where conformity is not a condition of belonging. You don't have to conform, you don't have to, so to speak, fit in to feel like you really belong there. You can be and feel a part of the community and still be really true to yourself and or be different. So that's very important to consider. And it makes it all the more important to do our best to remove the barriers for getting to such a space. Another indicator of this, and with that we've arrived at the last point, structures of validation, is that none of the interviewees mentioned validation by people on a higher hierarchical plane. However, several of them mentioned validation by people for whom they had responsibility, and that usually indicates that they're on a lower hierarchical plane. So this is a strong indicator of people in democratic education spaces being ready to listen to the people within that space, to make everybody comfortable in making their voice heard within that space, and to use the feedback from that to create a truly inclusive context. Again, that makes it even more important that we do our very best and actually do the work to remove all the hurdles we can from access to those spaces. The most important thing that I'd like you to take away from this presentation is challenging your assumptions. Please keep challenging those assumptions. Just because there are good intentions, it doesn't mean that the action that's taken because of these good intentions actually leads to the outcome that you want to have. So it's really important to actually do the research on this, do the work, and also listen to the people who are not part of democratic education spaces. Ask them, what keeps you from checking this out, and truly listen. So to end this on a very positive note, democratic education spaces have everything they need in their method to be really inclusive spaces, make people comfortable being themselves within a community as an important and integral part of a community. They also do a very, very good job in preparing the students for what critics like to call the real world. Students from democratic schools do acquire traditional denominators of achievement. It's just that those tend to be omitted when people talk about their democratic schooling experience. So this is just a little reminder. For some people, these things might be really important. If we want democratic education to be a success, we need to situate it firmly within the world that we live in. Within democratic education, we have a lot of the solutions to a lot of the current problems within education. So we need to make sure we create the right basis for all these solutions that we already have to actually reach the people we want to reach. Thanks for listening.